Welcome to Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case, the podcast where we take questions I've been asked in the past from so many different roles, along with questions you'll ask and we'll ask together to, learn. Along the way, we'll build our capacity to become a community of problem solvers. I'm your host, Janice Case. Let's get to it, shall we? All right, welcome, folks, to episode 10 of Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case. I am joined this morning by the beautiful Melissa Ellis. Melissa, we are hitting almost a month mark of self-isolation and social distancing, right? I know last week you shared that you were struggling with that, which was really fascinating because I loved hearing your angle about being an introvert anyway and struggling, right? Introverts are supposed to be thriving right now, but evidently that's not always the case. So how'd this week go for you?
So this week, I think it's a little bit better. The thing that I love about this show, Janice, and I know we can't share every single minute, but the conversations you and I have after the show are just as impactful as the ones we have during. So our conversation after the show really helped a lot with not only some other issues that were going on outside of work, but just my mental shift.
Yeah.
I really started focusing on not feeling like I have to do everything.
Yeah.
All the 24/7. I feel like because I'm in the house, I should be doing something. And no, I don't. So I kind of just put my focus this past week on letting work be work.
Good.
For those 8, 9, 10 hours, whatever it is I have to do. And then if after work, all I do is eat and read a book, then that's okay.
Yep.
I don't feel like I have to be on the move, on the go, accomplishing something. And so that helped a lot. Just the mental shift of, okay, work is work. We're going to focus on that. And then, so I guess it's just the change of mindset helped me a lot.
That's huge,
so
right?
It's really huge. And I hope that people are being gentle with themselves.
Yeah.
Because I think that's the part that is making COVID as stressful as it is that there's a lot of pressure on people to survive, first of all, but then there's this overwhelming pressure that we have to do all these other things. So I hope people are being gentle with themselves and with each other and allowing themselves to do whatever it is they need to do to just get through.
I love that. I think that's so important. And it, for me, it's been, I'm enjoying the slower pace, right? I was somebody who usually was in a hotel room at least once a week, on an airplane at least once a week, and so it's weird for me to think that it's going to be this way till June because our schools pretty much are closing, right? But I'm appreciating it, and like you, my job has been crazy busy. I love you saying, 8, 9, 10 hours. Like right now, you don't have a lot of control over how long you have to work every day, but that you can control what you do outside of that. And I love that you're embracing that. And it's funny because I found myself, I guess it was the end of last weekend, beating myself up is a little bit too harsh of it, but definitely kind of going, how am I not, on March 14th, when schools kind of were like, we're done, like a lot of people, I made myself a to-do list. All the stuff, right, that we're going to do while this is all going on. And I'm looking at the list going, I haven't done a darn thing from this list.
Exactly right.
And I was kind of what the heck? And I saw this great quote I was looking at as you were talking because I snapped a picture and I want to post it on Facebook. I just haven't done it yet. But it said, ignore productivity porn. Now more than ever, we must abandon the performative and embrace the authentic. And what you just described is embracing the authentic, right? And it hit home for me because I really do feel like I'm great about I don't feel pressure from social media. I don't look at other people doing all this stuff and go, oh my gosh, I need to do that. I don't feel that way at all. And I like to think that when I share things
on ourselves.
Exactly. And I like to think that when I put stuff up, people aren't taking it as, oh my God, Janice is doing this, I need to do it. It's not that, it's just sharing, right? But that quote really helped me kind of go, now more than ever, we have to not be influenced by, I love the expression, the productivity porn, right?
That's beautiful, and it's accurate. At the end of the day, there are going to be people who take this time and transform themselves into super people.
Yes.
Do all the million things they want to do, but you don't have to.
Exactly.
There's nothing in the world. There's no rule that says you have to come out of the other side of a freaking pandemic.
Right.
with a new language or a new skill or a new business. Like, you just
Exactly.
have to get through it, however that looks for you.
Whatever it looks like. But I'm going to add to that and say, and your superstar version might look very different from
Might
somebody
not.
else's, but let's
That's
not
right.
compare our superstar versions, right?
Absolutely.
Because, like you
Absolutely right.
said, me just getting through it could be my version of
That's
superstar,
right.
right?
Yep. Absolutely right.
So anyway, that kind of brings us then. We said this last week when we were introducing this 4-part series on trauma, that when we scheduled it, right, that I couldn't have predicted the timing with COVID-19. And then we talked briefly about one of the really scary realities is that there are people who live in homes where the fact is that being isolated is putting them at a higher risk. So,
Risk.
if you live,
Yeah.
for example, in a home where there's physical violence or emotional violence or substance abuse, etc., you are already likely experiencing greater incidence of stress because the stress of and the impacts of that violence, because the stress of isolation itself, right, can cause
Exactly.
the people who demonstrate those behaviors to have those behaviors exacerbated. So
Yep.
it was timely then that we were talking about trauma. And last week, of course, we heard really great things from Michelle, Patton, Swisher, and Lisa Dolan about how parents can support their children who've experienced trauma. But that, the whole series was born actually from the fact that somebody asked me, in fact, lots of folks have asked me over the years, right, how schools can support kids who've experienced trauma, because more and more at greater rates, that's what's showing up on their doorsteps, right? And somewhere in the episode, I think they say, they talk about the statistics of that, and we'll listen in and hear that. So anyway, that brings us to then this episode where we said, okay, so we talked about parents and supporting kids in trauma. Now, given that our schools are supporting kids at higher and higher rates, what can we do for them, right? What can we talk to teachers and leaders, et cetera, about? So with that in mind, before we go into the interview with Michelle and Lisa, I'd love to hear what you're thinking about in terms of, kind of what do you expect? Like, are you expecting anything as far as similarities and stuff from the conversation around parents and how it's going to translate to teachers and leaders?
You know what? I can't say that I have any expectations, but that is mainly because I think I went into the last one with a bunch of expectations,
Yeah.
and they just smacked every one of those suckers down. They were like, nope, that's not it. Nope, that's not it. That's
Yeah.
not how it works.
Yeah.
So I don't have expectations, but I will say that just in thinking about this episode, I'm curious because I don't think we as adults, we completely understand that, how we feel at work and how we're treated at work and whether or not we enjoy what we do matters because we spend X number of hours a day at this place or doing this thing.
Yeah.
Well, the same thing applies to kids.
Amen.
School is where they spend the majority of their waking hours.
Yep.
So if no matter what we're doing outside of school, if they're not being supported properly in school, then it's like beating your head against a wall.
Yeah.
So I'm very curious to hear their suggestions and what they think and how having a trauma-informed school, just like you have a trauma-informed community,
Exactly.
how that should look, what that should, how that will benefit your kids and how it can benefit teachers, because I'm sure there is benefit to them because it's their workplace too. It's where they're spending a great deal of their time too. So it's pretty relatable all the way around.
Yeah, that's so important. I love that you pointed that out. So, and what I love is that you talked about not having expectations, but having expectations last week that then were kind of slapped down. And actually, now that I think about it, it's really what they're really doing for us is breaking a lot of misconceptions. We have a lot of preconceptions, right, about trauma and kids who experience it that we're finding are in fact misconceptions that we're going to have to unpack. But I will say this, and it's going to be fantastic to listen to what they have to say today, that what I know with respect to how people learn is that it takes more than listening to one episode of a podcast to break those misconceptions, right? So, and we'll come back to that when we come back to wrap up after we've had the conversation. So I know everybody listening today is going to take a lot from this conversation with Michelle and Lisa. So let's get to it, shall we? We are really delighted to have Michelle Swisher and Lisa Dolan back with us. For those of you who were able to tune in to episode 9, you know already some of their background. But we are going to kick off this episode by asking them to reintroduce themselves. And today is a part 2 in a 4-part series around trauma, and very specifically how we support, especially kids who have experienced trauma. But as you saw in our conversation last week, and you'll see it today too, I'm sure, that does kind of tend to bleed over into the adults as well, because certainly one of our big takeaways last week is that, how adults support kids in part starts with how adults understand their own experience with trauma. So that is my way of introduction. And today, of course, we're going to be honing in on specifically the realm of school. Last week we focused really on parents. This week we're going to focus on school because both Michelle and Lisa play very vital roles in their local school district in Virginia. And certainly the work they're doing is represented all across the country. I can speak here in California that our leaders here that I work closely with, one of their number one concerns is how they're serving kids who have experienced trauma. So with that kind of universal bringing us together beginning, if you will, of the conversation, I'm going to kick off by asking Michelle to start us off by introducing herself and talking about her background around this in schools, and then I'll have Lisa do the same, and then we'll jump into our conversation. Michelle, go for it.
Hi, thanks Janice. Thanks for having us again. This is wonderful. So I'm Michelle Patton Swisher. I'm a school social worker here in Spotsylvania County, Virginia. I have been with Spotsylvania County for over 10 years now. My primary responsibility is really working with our vulnerable population. So I work a lot with our homeless students and families that are often in poverty situations.
Okay.
And I think really the trauma work that we've started here is really because of our great fearless leader, Lisa Dolan. She's the one who's made this all happen.
Sure.
And so along the way, she has kind of said, let's do this. But when we started really diving into this, we noticed a lot of our vulnerable populations have a pretty extensive ACE score and have pretty extensive needs, and how can we support them? So it really started, I would say, working with our families that were identified as McKinney-Vento or homeless.
Sure.
That way, and peeling back the layers of supports that are needed to support them, not only in the community, but as well as in the school, and what things can educators do to help support students is kind of what has driven that train and driven our school division to become trauma informed.
That's wonderful. And that's language that I know we're going to hear and dig into throughout the course of our conversation. So thank you for that, Michelle. Lisa, how about you?
Hello, and thanks for doing this, Janice. My name's Lisa Dolan. I am the lead school social worker for Spotsylvania County Schools. I've been in that role for probably 18 years. And several years ago, I had the opportunity to do a community collaboration wraparound conference with a bunch of different child serving agencies. We went down to Florida, had this really wonderful training on community collab. And in that, I was exposed to the adverse childhood experiences research. And so at that point, I kind of came back and said, hey, this is important. We need to start talking about this. And like Michelle said, the first place that we really applied things was to that population of students who were homeless, partially because Michelle and I worked so closely together, but also because it just instinctively rang true as to this is a good way to interact with students. And we've been able to gradually kind of build on those concepts and help teachers, help administrators, and of course it certainly helps that at the national level, we've got people really pushing the agenda of becoming trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive schools. And for me personally, in addition to that professional aspect, I am an adoptive mom, and so I have some personal experience
Sure.
with kids who have a trauma history as well that kind of continued my interest at both levels, personal and professional.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that, Lisa. So I'm trying to be very cognizant that we could have folks listening today who didn't listen last week, but they're going to go back after today, I have no doubt. So Michelle, I'm going to come to you real quick because you mentioned ACE and then Lisa talked a little bit, but let's go ahead and do the basics real quick, Michelle, about when we're talking about trauma, what do we mean? How do we determine, right, what trauma means in the life of a kid?
So we're talking about trauma that happens early in a child's life, between infant to the age of 18. When we're talking about trauma that's impacted, that's what we're talking about. And I think one of the most important things to remember is it is an individual experience. So it's what that person is perceiving as an event. that has either been physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has a lasting adverse effect on that person's functioning for spiritual well-being, emotional, physical, and mental. So everybody has a different perception of what they might have experienced, and it's really shifting that paradigm from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you.
Sure.
That's the most important thing, is what you want to start asking that question of what's happened to someone, versus that something's wrong with them.
Okay. And one of my big takeaways from last week, and you're capturing it here again, is the idea that trauma is not an event. And oftentimes, and it kind of aligns with your language about what happened to you, it's not an event. It's really the experience a person has as a result of something that's happened. And that something could have been a one-time thing, but it could also have been a series of somethings, yes?
Correct. And that's where that adverse childhood experiences really looks at what are those 10 things that have impacted someone.
Okay. And we'll put, folks, in the notes of the episode notes today that I post on our Facebook page, we'll put some of the key resources to include that website around where you can go in and look a little bit more at the ACE, those 10 components of the ACE assessment, if you will, that Michelle mentioned, etc. So Lisa, let's shift to you. It is kind of amazing, right, that all three of us have been in education for a really long time, and really this language of trauma sensitive, trauma informed is still relatively new. I mean, I would say even in the last 5, maybe 10 years, but it's really new language. So when we talk about a trauma informed school, what do you feel like are the characteristics? And so this is kind of like putting the it's backwards mapping, right? It's putting the end goal in mind, right? What does it look like when a school is a trauma-informed school? And then we're going to talk about how we get them there.
Yeah, well, it's definitely a process.
Yeah.
So that's an important piece to learn. And there's no one fix to this process. It's
Okay.
not like you do one thing and you're suddenly trauma sensitive and trauma informed. It really is a philosophical paradigm shift. And there's some important themes that occur around becoming trauma informed. Probably the most important theme is the idea of safety.
Okay.
And everyone being safe, and it goes beyond the physical safety and the freedom as far as the windows and the doors and all of that, to the emotional safety aspect of it, and the freedom of being bullied or the freedom of being teased, those kinds of aspects. So the first thing we talk to teachers about is safety. We really need to create that safe environment for kids. The second theme is really about trust. And with our vulnerable kids, particularly our kids that have trauma histories, they don't come to us ready to trust adults. In fact, they come to us not trusting adults because most of their trauma is interpersonal in the dynamic. So most of that has occurred in a relationship where someone should be caring and loving and safe to them, and it hasn't been. So they come to us already untrusting of adults. So building trust is another important theme. Some of the other themes are collaboration, working with the student, particularly when there's a problem to solve, especially when it's a behavioral concern. The old paradigm of traditional kinds of classroom management was the teacher put a behavior plan in place, implemented that with the child. You earned or you lost.
Right.
And yes, that probably works with kids who haven't had trauma experiences.
Sure.
But kids who had significant trauma experiences, that's not going to work. So the new paradigm is really about building that connection, that relationship, so that you can collaborate with them. Offering choices is a theme. Offering the idea of staff listening, and then, of course, the idea of building a culture in your environment that leads to that safety, trust, and relationships. Relationships are key.
Right.
Relationship is where the magic occurs.
Okay.
And so we really want to have every child in a building have a caring, stable relationship with an adult in that building, a connection of some kind.
Okay.
And then the final theme that I'll comment on is the idea of resiliency. So the antidote, so to speak, to trauma, it depends upon who you talk to, but some people will say attachment is the antidote to trauma.
Okay.
And I think that is completely true. the bigger kind of picture is this idea of resiliency being the antidote to trauma. And the interesting piece of that is resiliency can be taught. You're not born with resiliency. You have to learn that. And so with teachers and with schools in particularly, when we start talking about social emotional learning, the underlying piece of that is building resiliency skills. And if you can be taught resiliency, who better to do it than teachers? So we just have to give them the tools to be able to teach how do we become more resilient individuals.
Okay, so there's so much there, and I'm so glad we have time to unpack some of it. So before we start unpacking those themes, and I caught several of them. I caught safety and trust and collaboration, offering choices, resiliency, of course, having the idea of having one caring connection with an adult in their school. Ultimately, kind of shocker of all shockers, most of those coming down to relationships, right? How we're building relationships with kids. The wonderful thing about that is that that's something we already know as educators has to be a fundamental part of the culture that we build in a school, right? So now it's about taking that thing we know and figuring out how we dig deep to actually make it happen for every child. Because I know one of the things we talked about last week is we won't always know every kid who has experienced trauma. We won't always know what happened because some of it happened so early that they can't actually articulate memories. And not every kid's walking around with a sign that says my ACE score is 3 or, my ACE score is 7 or whatever. So then we got to last week this idea of we don't have to know necessarily that a lot of what you just listed, offering choices, resiliency, collaboration, trust, safety, if we can do that for every kid, we're going to maximize learning, right? And learning both how to kind of be, if you will, even in light of trauma, but also the learning of the academics of schools. So Michelle, I want to ask you this question. I want to kind of have you kick us off on this, and then I want to come back to some of these and unpack them. I'm thinking about the school leader now, right? Because our audience is going to be leaders and teachers and parents and, whomever else. How do you either determine a school's readiness for the work that you all do, the training that you do, et cetera, and or ready or not, right? How do you begin, when I think in terms of the school leader especially, how do you begin the conversation that leads to the work to help them be able to develop these cultures?
I think it's using the language all the time. I think that's where they need to start, but I also think they need to start with really good professional development.
Okay.
You need to start with a foundation to give professional development school tools and skills for your staff, because I think everybody goes into education because they want to help students.
Sure.
And we all get burned out. We all get stressed out. We need something to light our fire. And a lot of times that can come from professional development and surrounding yourself with like-minded people. Our supervisor, our boss, used a thing at the beginning of the school year talking about marigolds and walnuts.
Okay.
So marigolds are often put in a garden to help things grow, right?
Okay.
And walnuts are, they come from a tree. They don't always look pretty, and they fall off the tree. And so you've got to surround yourself with marigolds and really promote, blooming within your building of how you're going to do that. And one of the first things you can do is meeting Maslow's hierarchy of needs, making sure that everybody in your building understands about vulnerable populations and what they need, making sure everybody understands in your building about ACE and what adverse childhood experiences, kind of giving that foundation, because what really teachers want is they want the tools of how do I stop behaviors in my classroom, right? That's really what kind of shows itself during the day in a classroom of how hard work can be with students that might have a high ACE score because of the brain and where they're lacking skills of how to help teach those skills. So it's really, formulating ways in your building to build strong teams within each grade level, I think is really important.
Sure.
And educating your students. But the other big thing I think that we have seen successful in various districts and various school buildings within our own district is you have principals that are willing to rely on the professionals in their building to do the work, using their school social workers, accessing their school counselors, looking for leadership from central office to help implement these things, looking for resources outside of your community that may be able to access and teach these skills, and being willing to try new things. I mean, we introduced yoga into classrooms a couple years ago,
Okay.
and now we have 8 sites that are using yoga. I mean, that's pretty kind of out there thinking when you think about education. Why would we use yoga? Well, you had administrators who were willing to try that.
So talk a little bit about that as one strategy. When you say they use yoga, what does that look like? How are they using it? When are they doing it?
So we actually have employed a yoga instructor
Okay.
to come into certain schools, and they've worked with particular students on yoga. I mean, they actually do yoga every week.
Okay.
And it's wonderful because you have kids that are learning some skills to really help heal the brain is
Okay.
what you're shooting for, you know. And so there's lots of other strategies.
Sure.
Having space in a classroom where kids can take a break if they need it, what
Okay.
that looks like, teaching kids what that is, teaching kids about when you flip your lid, what does that look like?
Right.
Why do you flip your lid? And having them understand that, because kids are sponges. Teach
Yeah.
it to them. They will embrace it.
And when you use an expression like "flip your lid," that's not an off-the-cuff expression, right? That's an actual term, if you will, that you use to talk with kids about regulation, right?
Absolutely. There's a whole model. The brain is like the size of the palm of your hand, and when you flip your lid, your hand goes up, and you have been activated into the emotional part of your brain.
Okay, so Lisa, let's pick up on that then. We spent some time on this last week, but because obviously a big part of what the adults around kids are working toward is helping them to recognize when they flip their lid, when they're starting to get into that zone where they need to engage in some self-regulation. But we talked last week about it starts with the adults. I'm going to wager a guess some of the strategies with parents are the same ones that you teach teachers. But talk to us about how you talk with teachers and educators about supporting kids in regulating.
Yeah. So the idea, first of all, the flip your lid, just so that people have that reference, is Dan Siegel's work.
Okay.
And so you can go and you can look and you can find lots of videos about flipping your lid.
Excellent.
But the idea is really based on brain science. And so our regulation tools kind of start with the idea of, as an infant, we regulate the infant, the adult regulates the infant. And then gradually we begin to co-regulate, where the infant and the adult interact with each other to help to kind of regulate. And then slowly we learn to regulate ourselves. We still co-regulate into adulthood quite a bit, but we learn to kind of self-regulate as we get older. So the idea is, first and foremost, the adult has to regulate themselves.
Right.
You cannot help a child who is dysregulated if you were dysregulated.
Sure.
All that's going to do is continue to up the ante. Now, that is nowhere near as easy to do as I say that. It's much easier to say it than it is to actually live it.
Sure.
But just educating people on ideas like the crisis cycle, which is kind of what happens when we become dysregulated. We start up this hill, so to speak, to get to a crisis, and then we kind of crash on the other side of it. So we educate adults about their own crisis cycle, about what it is to be triggered, where do they feel that in their body, and how do they regulate themselves, and what tools do they have in their toolbox, so to speak, to regulate themselves. And then also from there, they can help to co-regulate kids. Whatever that situation is, you don't want to follow the kid up the crisis cycle. You want to kind of stay below them so that you're able to help to regulate that.
So I think, and I'm taking so much away from last week, and I'm trying to make sure we include, some of that information here. So that regulation piece is really huge, and what I love about our conversations is that we've really honed in on the idea that the adult has to also recognize when they're flipping their lid and be able to engage in their own self-regulation in order to be able to help the kid begin to engage in their own regulation, co-regulating it first, as you said, etc. And I'm sitting here wondering to myself, I've got my teacher hat on, right? So I'm thinking in terms of, from a teacher's perspective, my principal just brought in these social workers, and now we're going to be a trauma-informed school, right? And the tone comes from, here's the next thing, right? So, and I'm sure you all have faced that many, many a time. So with my teacher's hat on, right, I'm wondering a couple of things. The first thing I'm wondering is, So how do I know the difference between a kid who's flipping their lid because they've experienced trauma or a kid who's just being defiant because they like to be defiant? And what do I do different? Do I do anything different?
So first of all, I guess I'm going to say it doesn't matter if it's a kid who's flipping their lid because they're defiant or flipping their lid because they have a trauma experience. It doesn't matter. We treat everybody as if they've had a trauma experience. And in fact, the research holds that up, that the majority of us, if you look in your classroom, it's 1 in every 5 students are going to have a significant trauma history. And then those that don't still have trauma histories. It's common. The ACE research says that. And it works. The methods work for everybody. The key to that is that the things that would work with students who have lower levels of trauma experiences can be traumatizing to students who have trauma histories. But the things that work with our students with trauma histories work fine with the other kids. So we do the same thing. It's really, I tell people, it's not rocket science.
Sure.
It's the stuff you know to do already. It's just learning more about the brain so that it really begins to make sense and you can go deeper into what you know to do. Most teachers know we need to build relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the record, I knew the answer before I asked that question, right? But I'm so glad to hear you nail the answer, in the way that you did, that in the end, it doesn't matter. We made the connection previously about it's the same idea behind kind of the best setting for kids with disabilities as a general ed classroom where the teacher is modifying and accommodating for everyone the same way they would with a student who has an IEP, right? That the good practice is the good practice regardless. Same thing here. And I love that you have the background with the brain research, both of you, because I think that's important because what that brain research is helping to tell us is that regardless of why they ended up starting to go through the crisis cycle or beginning to kind of head up that ladder, regardless of why, the same parts of the brain are triggered. And as a result, the same response by the adult is going to have a positive healing effect, regardless of the why. And I think that's huge. So Michelle, I'm going to ask you this question then. So I'm curious about my second teacher hat question was, and Lisa, you said this, you said easy to say, more difficult to do. Let's acknowledge that. So Michelle, because you guys have worked with so many teachers, I would love to hear about an example. It can be a particular teacher, without who can remain nameless, but of someone who does this well in their classroom. What I'm looking for is, what does it look like in my classroom when I'm doing this well? Because to your point, it's not something I'm doing on top of everything else I do. It's kind of how I'm doing things, right? So what does it look like for a teacher who's doing this effectively?
I think there's a couple different things to note, but I am going to say the first thing, it's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
I think that's important to remember as well. You can start implementing strategies in your classroom, but it is going to be, you're building your base as you go along to kind of what you want your classroom to look like. And so you're going to want to incorporate a lot of different things. And I think the first and foremost thing is working on that relationship with your students. So people are always like, well, I have relationships, or I don't know how to form a relationship.
Right.
So a couple things that I think are quick and easy to do to build a relationship in your class is do something called one and done. Do one favor or connection or show empathy to one student is very powerful.
Okay.
Like, one and done. Another one is...
Well, before you go on to that next one, what does that look like? Can you give me an example?
So doing one thing intentionally for one student.
Okay.
To help support them in whatever they need and teaching them empathy is what you're looking for.
Got it. Okay.
The next one is called 2 for 10. Invest 2 minutes per day for 10 consecutive days with a student most needing a connection. So people know in their classroom who they need to connect with.
Right.
Teachers learn that. So what you're going to do is intentionally invest 2 minutes a day for 10 days in a row with a student.
Okay.
And you're not going to talk about academics. You may want to talk about their family dog or what they like to do on the weekends, or you're working on that relationship piece. The other one is called 3 and 30, and this is a lot harder, but this is where you really start building you're building your ship of building the relationship in your classroom. It's called 3 and 30. Discover 3 things, and not their name, about every student in the first 30 days.
Okay.
So you're going to find out 3 things about your student in the first 30 days that they're in your classroom.
Okay.
But what you're wanting to do is build that relationship, because once you start building that relationship, these other strategies are going to help in managing your classroom
Okay.
to do that.
Okay.
I think the other thing is really, kids need an orderly environment in their classroom.
Okay.
You don't want, we all walked into those classrooms where it's messy.
Yeah.
And not because they're learning, that's what they're doing, but kids need some order and things to be arranged. Flexible seating is a really positive thing for students, because I'm learning that very quickly working from home, that I don't want to sit in a chair all day.
Yes. What a great point, right? Yeah.
We're all learning different ways of how we like to manage our time. And so I think it's important to be cognizant of that with our students. Another successful strategy is really possibly having morning meetings.
Okay.
So you meet with your class every day and you talk about things every single day with your class, and that's building that relationship. But it's also giving an opportunity to have those clear expectations and rules.
Yeah.
I think are really important. And routine.
Absolutely.
Kids need that structure and routine. They need to know that. Lots of praise is very helpful as well. Class-wide expectations, but then class-wide of how we handle a situation. Having a place where kids can take a break if they need it.
Sure.
I think one of, Lisa and I've talked before, one of my biggest pet peeves is when people call kids out in the middle of a class.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And I can give the best example I think of when I think of this is, how many times would a teacher like a principal to pop their head in your classroom and go, "Hey, you didn't turn in that document I was been waiting for."
Right, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
It doesn't feel good, right? We don't like that. So I think it's to be important of what you don't like and what you wouldn't want done to you. It's kind of that same thing. We also need to have, the big safety piece I think is important. You want people to know it's a safe place to be able to work with a teacher. But if you have a student that gets escalated, it's how you respond as well. So low and slow. That's a simple thing to think about. Low and slow. Lower your voice, lower your breathing, speak short sentences. That is not when you're going to dive into why did you do this.
Yeah.
They're not going to be in that space. They're going to be in their emotional part of their brain. So if we're doing that well and doing, low and slow, talking to them, it's going to help. Wearing that trauma lens will always be able to provide you that opportunity of how you need to address your student. But I really think I keep going back to that, physical space being orderly, the relationship being building blocks for folks. And I do think there's one thing it's important to note of what we're all hardwired for in our brain. We are only hardwired for sadness, joy, disgust, anger, surprise, and fear. That's all we're hardwired for.
Okay.
Everything else has to be taught to you. So if you have a child in your class that doesn't show empathy or forgiveness, they may have not been taught that. And I joke, I learned this at one of Eric Jensen's trainings. Parenting has been outsourced. So, we have to get off that mindset of that's not our job to teach that.
Absolutely.
No, it is. It's our job as a community to teach things, but you have to be taught humility, forgiveness, empathy, compassion, optimism, sympathy, patience, shame, cooperation, and gratitude. You have to be taught those things. So implementing those strategies in your classroom will benefit all of your students.
Those are all significant, and I know we'll make sure that we're capturing some of those in the episode notes, and then folks can come back in and listen to those again, because those are going to be really critical pieces, obviously, as people move forward and thinking about it. And I think that capturing the what has to be taught versus the what we're hardwired for is a huge piece. And in my mind, and it's something we constantly say as educators, is the most kind of immediate way we do that is modeling it, right? If we're not modeling those things that need to be taught, empathy is not something you stand in front of the room and give a definition of and say, now here's empathy and everybody go do it, right? It's you actually model it for kids. And I had a couple of thoughts while you were talking, and then I'm going to go to Lisa because I want to dig a little bit deeper. But, the thing I thought of, Michelle, when you were talking about as the teacher and how you respond, right? Your response when a student starts to go into crisis is so huge. And I have a vivid memory of a time when one of my kids, and like third grade, so early, so young, and came home just so, on some level, traumatized herself, but certainly so upset because the teacher had as she described the situation that had happened in the class that day, the teacher clearly had a student with a disability who had some kind of a contract from a behavior standpoint, etc. And the issue escalated in the classroom. And the teacher is very mild mannered, but he, at some point, when the student didn't respond to his prompts around the contract, got frustrated and took the paper off the desk and crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. And the impact on my kid when she came home, she was so upset because A, she had never seen the teacher like that. And suddenly it was like, wait, I thought he was a nice guy. Maybe he's not a nice guy. Now I'm questioning who he is. And of course, B, because this poor kid in the classroom, who generally was one of those kids who got in trouble a lot, and she talked about that a lot. She was still really hurt on his behalf. And so when I reached out to the teacher, it was simply to say, look, I don't know what happened today, but I want you to know what her experience was, because there's some repair to be done with the relationship. Obviously, more with that young man, right, than my kid. But the messaging for him was, you didn't just have an interaction with him today. You had an interaction with your whole class. And it's going to be really important for you to go back and fix that. You can't just kind of move on, right? And he responded well to it. It was great. But again, that modeling piece, we're constantly modeling something when we're in front of kids. The question becomes, are we modeling things we want them to repeat or not, right? So Lisa,
Absolutely.
yeah. So Lisa, I want to come over to you now because, Michelle was really great about digging deep with the strategies with teachers. And what we know, of course, is all of that has to be supported by school leaders. And so I'm wondering if you have to convince, or are most school leaders open to it? But, how do you help a school leader see that they need this, right? And once you do, right, Michelle mentioned professional development earlier, of course, but what are some of the first structures you talk about with school leaders that they can put in place to then create the bigger structure that will be the safe space teachers need to do this work in classrooms?
I think that one of the things that's important to think about with this is in the professional development process, first and foremost, they have to understand the adverse childhood experiences piece.
Yep.
And so you start there.
Okay.
Now, you pretty quickly move into the concepts of resiliency and how you can build and teach resiliency.
Okay.
If I have a selling point with administrators, it's probably the idea of lagging skills. So we all kind of understand that kids, when they come to us, lack certain skills academically. Kindergartners can't read.
Sure.
And we understand that we have to teach that in multiple ways. We have to show visually, we have to do orally, we have to do physical things, we have to try 15 different strategies to learn things. And there's a process that we have used in order to teach kids how to read. The idea of social emotional learning is really the same concept. It begins with an assessment of what are the lagging skills, and then targeting how to kind of move forward. So when you start to talk to administrators and you start with, here's how frequent this is what's occurring in your school, and they all buy that now. 5 or 6 years ago when we started this, nobody really bought into that.
Yeah.
Now they all really buy into the ideas of trauma, and our kids that are having challenging behaviors really have trauma histories, and that changes the way their brain functions. So you start with the adverse childhood experiences, how frequent it is, maybe move into the brain science a little bit because it's just really cool. I think it makes you more legitimate. Mm-hmm. It's not a soft science anymore. It's beginning to be really hard science at this point because of the brain information. And then you can kind of start to move into, here's some of the strategies. And I'm a big fan of Dr. Bruce Perry. And so I like to really kind of cite his work, partially because he's very well known at this point in this particular area of learning, but also because you really can get the scientific piece of things. So when I start to talk to people about regulation and I throw out words like somatosensory regulation tools, and they go, "Wow, what is that?"
Right,
because suddenly
right.
it sounds so sophisticated, and it's really things like marching in place and doing jumping jacks and doing brain gym or Balaviz kinds of activities or those kinds of things that we already know. It just gives you the brain science behind it, and that I think helps administrators to kind of buy into that. The other thing is when it works, it works.
Amen.
And it's very exciting to see a school that implements some things. And even like we had one school in Spotsy that put up pictures of every student in their building and went through and said, who has a strong relationship with someone in our building? And they just put stickers on the pictures. And then they took a step back and they looked at that and they said, okay, there's X number of kids in our building that don't have a strong relationship. It was a very powerful visual.
Yep.
And then they put in place, how are we going to ensure that those students are going to have strong relationships? And they spent a year doing that, and they noticed the decrease in the discipline referrals and the office referrals and the escalation of behavior that occurred. Simple strategy, very powerful. So administrators buy into.
Absolutely.
It works. It doesn't work overnight. The trauma didn't occur overnight. It's going to take some time. But when they start to see the value, it's really powerful because they create very interesting ways to address the needs in their buildings. They don't necessarily need us as the experts to create it. They need us as the experts to kind of give them the way to think about it. And then they go on and move forward and create really extremely cool ideas that work in their building.
It's the beauty of the partnerships, right? Like you said, you're bringing a certain level of expertise to the table. They're bringing their own different expertise to the table, and when you can blend those, as you guys were both talking, it made me think about a couple of things, and I love that you responded kind of deeply around the leadership piece there, Lisa, because my experience is that first and foremost, as a school leader, you have to be armed with the why, right, for your staff, right? You have to be able to come to the table and say, here's the evidence that shows we have to do something different, right? Whatever it is. Your example that you just gave is very much like an example that I have offered that I did myself as a school principal, but I did two pieces to it. Your piece was saying to teachers, here's every kid in the building. Who are the kids you feel like you have a close connection to? Go mark them, right? So that everybody can kind of see that. The other side of that is surveying kids, right? So when we did an annual culture, if you will, survey, one of the questions was name 2 adults in the school to whom you feel closely connected. And we define closely connected as they are people who, when something a positive happens, you can't wait to tell them, and people with whom, when something not great happens, you can go to and talk to them about it. That's how we defined it for them. And so we took that survey and we overlay it with what the staff thought, right? And so that same board, we had a second one with the staff. So here are all the staff in the building: principal, teachers, janitors. It didn't matter what your title was, and there was a check mark next to your name every time a kid named you, and it was powerful on both sides. A, to see the kids who didn't, who none of our staff could identify as feeling a close connection to, and then B, the revelation for some of our staff that they thought they were building relationships that they weren't really building because the kids didn't name them, and it was. The process up to that, and I actually walk people through this in the book that I published, but is this idea that you have to get people ready for it, right? You don't want to slap them in the face with it, but on the other hand, we also have to be willing to face the hard truths. The other strategy that we've used is along your same lines, but at a certain point in the school year, into the first quarter, whatever it is, a postcard for every kid. Here's the postcard, pre-labeled. Every kid has one, alphabetical order, in the cafeteria where our staff is meeting. We want everybody to go choose 5. Who are 5 kids you know well enough that you would send a note to them into the first quarter to say, hey, it's only the end of the first quarter, so much school year ahead of us, let's work together, blah, 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 whatever the positive note was, right? To ensure that every kid got a personal contact. And after everybody had taken the cards of the kids that they felt confident about, the realization that there were about 300 cards sitting there that nobody felt like they knew enough about that kid to be able to write them a note. And we had said to them, whatever's left, we're going to take care of. So don't worry about that, right? Don't falsely take them. We'll take care of anybody else. And the cool thing later is that teachers would come in and be like, let me look through that one more time. There's got to be some more kids in here that I can write for. But the purpose was to identify clearly for everybody, we have to do something different. Now, what's the something different going to be? And you've talked about a lot of things. And like you said, then they step up, right? And they say, gosh, could we do this? We've seen everything from, every staff member takes 5 kids and now they're going to mentor them throughout the year. Certainly, we've built advisory programs around exactly this kind of thing. So I love your last note that once you help them establish the why and show them the training around the brain science, et cetera, that can be done so that people feel like, oh gosh, we actually know how to do this. Then it's just a matter of kind of coming up with the way we'll do it in our school to meet the unique needs of our kids, right? So many pieces that you guys brought up, and just like last week, I feel like we could keep talking about any one of these at a very deep level. I do want to go back to the one thing you said, Lisa, and both of you can respond to this. We'll start with you, Lisa, and then go to Michelle, and then we're going to do final word. But you talked about how critical resiliency was, teaching resiliency. You said that when you talked about the first kind of themes, if you will. So, Lisa, give me an example of how a teacher teaches resiliency.
Teach problem solving.
Okay.
That's a perfect way to kind of begin with teaching the ideas behind resiliency. Also, just teaching those basic social emotional skills is going to build that resiliency. So teaching the ability, kindergarten kids, the ability to identify their emotions, teaching kindergarten kids the emotional language, teaching them what is good touch, bad touch. All of those things are going to begin to build the resiliency. And then, as kids get older, getting more detailed about problem solving, about compromise or win-win versus win-lose or lose-win, how all of those pieces kind of fit together. It's really that social emotional piece and being, I think the difference that I want to emphasize is being intentional about it.
Okay.
We forever in Spotsy County, Head Start has used a social emotional curriculum.
Okay.
But they have treated it as a 15-minute lesson, and then you move on. That is not the way this is going to work. This has to be, you infuse the concepts of social emotional into your entire day. And so social emotional is first and foremost. And then underneath that is English and math and reading and all of those other things, because what's going to make us successful adults, successful people, successful humans is that ability to connect. And we need to learn that. We have to be taught that. And unfortunately, our kids that have trauma experiences have delays in that area. And so perfect place for them to come. School, we're going to take care of them.
I love that. And reminding ourselves that it is, you're, like you said, and Michelle, you said this earlier, that school is, we have to just accept the fact that there are some things that there once upon a time we said that's not our job. That is our job, right? It's all our job now. That's just the truth. But what I love about the roles that you guys play is that you do both, right? You're not just having conversations with educators in isolation or with parents in isolation. You're doing both, which means you're also building bridges between them that 5 years ago, 10 years ago couldn't have been imagined. So Michelle, so Lisa, I'm going to go to Michelle, and then heads up, I'm coming to you for last word, and then back to Michelle for last word. So Michelle, with what Lisa just said, and I think it was you who said earlier that we have to teach them those things. Here are the things that they're hardwired for. Here are the things that we have to teach them. As a teacher, what does it look like when a kid is resilient? What are the characteristics that a kid who actually now has learned some of the things that Lisa mentioned? What do they look like in my classroom? The kid who is resilient. I think we can all identify what the kid looks like who isn't, but the kid who is.
I think the kid that's resilient is able to bounce back from a situation. So
Okay.
they can self-regulate when something comes at them. They can self-regulate. They have reason. They can relate to others. You know, those are the things that you're able to do. And we all have had moments in our lives where we've had to be resilient.
Yeah.
I mean, for whatever point in your life. And helping students learn those skills of how to regulate, how to relate, how to reason is preparing them for adult life.
Okay.
And it goes to that social emotional learning side. So, you know, I think it's a collaborative effort of both, you know, school and home and community to work with families and students to do all of those skills.
Yeah.
You know, and I just want to make one real quick comment. You know, we often think about when things aren't going well and we tell people things aren't going well. I think it's important to remember for every one negative you get, you need 10 positive to
That's so
counter
true.
that negative comment. So when you have a student who is not regulated and that is being pointed out to them repeatedly, you got to work extra hard to give that positive piece in there. And using specific praise is important. Not like, hey, you did a good job today.
Right.
You know, I noticed you did a good job paying attention in class today. Those, you know, Lisa talks about it all the time, that the statement "I noticed" is so powerful.
Yeah.
And giving that opportunity for kids that are regulated to even share that with kids that might be dysregulated at that moment.
Yeah. Absolutely. Building in those opportunities for kids to do it for each other, right? Which is a way of helping them build that skill. And it reminded me too, and I thought about this earlier, there's a great book called The Happiness Advantage by Sean Aker. He gets into some of the same brain research that you all are talking about. And part of it is, he talks about your piece there about for every negative, you need 10 positives. But the premise of his book is that we often operate on this myth that if we're successful, we'll be happy. And in fact, the way the brain is wired, it's the opposite, that by feeling happiness, you actually then generate more success in your life across all realms. And he does talk, and Lisa, you were talking about this earlier, which also triggered that connection. He talks about how we can control that, right? But we actually have the ability to rewire our own brains to shift from a no, as soon as I get the next job, as soon as I get the A, as soon as I get the what, I'll feel happy, to no, here are the things I can do to actually rewire my brain to feel happiness so that then the success comes along. So I love the connections kind of between those, because we do want to walk away from this conversation feeling like we have not, I'm going to say the control, but that we can control, that we can actually impact where we are right now in time, to help kids be more resilient, and frankly, to help ourselves be more resilient. So thank you for that. So Lisa, I'm coming to you first, then back to Michelle. But last word, you know, when we had our pre-taping chat, I asked you guys to think about last word in terms of all of this is well and good, and now we have COVID-19. So, right. So with that, right, we have teachers and leaders by the hundreds of thousands across the country right now launching or preparing to launch distance learning for their kids so that they can do something meaningful between now and the end of the year. And yet, even in that model, some of our kids who, certainly have those higher ACE scores, have experienced trauma. For some of our kids who never technically, by the book, if you will, experience trauma, they're experiencing it right now because this is, something that can be a traumatic experience for people. And for some of our kids who are in situations right now where they're experiencing ongoing trauma every time they go home, right? And now they're stuck there. So what can you offer to the teachers and the leaders who are still going to have a chance to have an impact on kids from a distance in a very different way? What would you share with them now to be thinking about or to try to do in that, to both take care of kids and to even take care of themselves?
It's a really interesting question because I personally have kind of seen, I have a 9th grader and an 8th grader, and that first week when we were back in school, they were bombarded with emails. I think they must have gotten 25 emails a day from from teachers wanting to work and wanting to do and wanting to be engaged. It comes from a place of heart. But I think right now what we have to do is first and foremost, we have to realize the level of stress that people are under.
Yeah.
And when there is that level of stress, go back to the concepts of Maslow's hierarchy of need.
Yeah.
Schools need to focus on basic needs for families right now. Education and learning and all of that is so much higher on that pyramid of Maslow's needs. First and foremost, let's focus on basic needs, and then let's focus on connections and relationships. So if you're going to send out those learning opportunities for kids, let's make them about something that is social and emotional. Let's have them do yoga once a week for their PE grade.
Okay.
Or let's have them explore a drum circle for their arts or chorus kinds of grades. Let's build in some rhythmic movement kinds of ideas for kids in those learning activities that are going to help soothe right now.
Okay.
And we've got to have teachers taking care of themselves, because they're worrying themselves to death about their kids and about their own families and managing all of those things. So everybody take that deep breath, manage those basic needs, and take care of themselves. The learning will come.
Yeah.
And right now, it's the emotional piece that we've got to focus on.
So thank you for that, Lisa. And I'm going to come to Michelle. And before I do, I'm going to say, my running joke is 5 people might hear this, 500 people might hear this, who knows? But what's so important about what you just said, Lisa, is that we know it, right? We know that we have to take care of the basic skills. And we see schools all across the country who are feeding kids and those kinds of things. And yet the pressure we are feeling at a larger level is, what are we going to do to educate kids? We can't let kids lose a month or two. In other words, but when I say that, I mean at the kind of newsworthy level, if you will, right? So there's no question that schools know we have to take care of the basic needs, and yet the pressure they feel is about the academics. So I'm so glad you just said what you said, because I think it's an important message for everybody to hear, and so that everybody can kind of get on this bandwagon, if you will, of how are we making sure they're safe and fed and have a roof and all of those things. And your last point there, that the learning will come. It will absolutely come. But their kind of basic safety right now and their ability to navigate the next couple of months is going to be what makes the learning an option after, right? So we're going to do the distance learning. Of course we are. But making sure that we're deliberate about the social emotional piece, to your point. And I hope that we start to hear that at a broader conversation so that our schools feel supported in making that their focus. All right, Michelle, final word, friend.
So I am all about what Lisa said.
Okay.
So I cannot tell you how I am. I'm quite irritated that we're looking at wanting to educate folks right now when we can't even meet basic needs. And part of that is I am going out and seeing students right now. I go out once a week and meet with kids that are living in conditions that aren't great, to deliver food. And I hear the worry from parents.
Yeah.
And so I encourage people that are in administration areas to talk to their parents.
Okay.
Because they need to hear what the worries and the fears are right now for folks. Families I'm working with, they are fearful, yes, about their children's education, and they're panicking of how am I going to get Wi-Fi and a device, or that system doesn't work on my phone. Yeah. That's the only device I have. And so that should not be their worries. They're worrying about where they can find toilet paper.
Yeah.
Or where are we going to get food from?
Yep.
Or we've lost our job. How are we going to continue to pay our bills? And it's just compounding that. And so I think a lot of right now is that relationship piece that Lisa mentioned, because sometimes they look to the school to just, what do we do? Yeah. And as an institution or a system within your community, you have the broadest ability to tell people it's going to be okay. Yeah. It is. Kids are missing their friends. Kids are missing their teachers. Sending emails is great, but we don't check our emails. Yeah. It is much better to be making that phone call. And maybe you make that phone call at 6:30 or 7 o'clock at night because mom has worked all day. Yeah. She still has a job. And I just think it's important to be giving our families resources right now to meet those basic needs is more important than upping a reading level.
I wonder, with that, Michelle, I really wonder, if I were a school principal right now, right, to your point, to spend a week with my teachers not sending out lessons, but instead 5 phone calls a day to 5 of my kids, to cover every kid in the school by the end of a week, to then share back with a school leader. Here's what they're worried about. Here's what they need.
Yeah, and to talk about some good stuff that's happening. Because it's
Absolutely.
not all bad stuff, you know? I mean, you know, playing basketball with your kids or taking a walk
Of
or
course.
doing s'mores around a fire. All of those are wonderful things that people are doing with their children right now. But we're doing that because we need, one, something to do. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
that's the reality. But the other stuff is still worrisome.
Yeah.
And how do we help support families right now that there's a lot unknown, not only just from like an educational standpoint, but a financial aspect, a home life aspect. And let's be honest, people are afraid they're going to get sick and they're going to die.
Exactly.
How do we support that as well? And, you know, educating people on how to be safe in that manner. And I do think it's the school's responsibility to keep giving that information, because sometimes we're the only connection that people have outside of their home.
That's exactly right.
And talking to families about how to stay safe, not only from the virus, but within your own family, and keeping, you know, sanity, because
Yeah.
it can be really hard to stay in your house, especially if your house has some unsafe features to it. What does that look like, and how do you stay safe?
Yeah.
So there's just a very complex area, but I do think one of the things that Lisa said is really important is that educators are taking care of themselves. You can't give from an empty cup.
Yep.
And sometimes you just need to step away for a little while and take a break. And that's okay. That's okay to take care of yourself in some way as well.
I appreciate that. You guys, seriously, I just can't thank you enough. And I know we only had these 2 episodes scheduled so far, but shocker of all shockers, I'll be calling on you again, just like everybody who talks to you does. You've really just painted a picture for when we come back to whatever's going to be the new normal in schools. But certainly this last part really speaking to the folks who are on the front line right now trying to do this work with kids. So thank you both so much for being a part of our conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, Melissa, I want to start our wrap up of this episode with that ACE data that I think it was Lisa mentioned, and she said that 1 in every 5 students likely has experienced trauma. I mean, my educator's heart was just so impacted by everything in the episode, but you know, that point I feel like is so important for us as educators and the people who are listening as educators to really let that hit home. This idea that they talked about it last time, they talked about it this time. I have no doubt you're going to touch on it, but that every child, right, that the things that they're asking us to do in schools is good for every child. So last week I shared that, you know, my own ACE score was a 6, probably could have been higher. And the way that translated for me as a child in school is that school saved me. And as a school principal, when I talked with teachers about relationships with kids, I always started with that I was one of those kids where school saved me. The more time I spent at school, the safer I was. That was just the truth, right? But my teachers, kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, would never have identified me, right? If we were talking about supporting kids with trauma from the lens of, well, let's identify who's experienced trauma and then we'll do that with them, I would have been a lost kid, right? Because I wouldn't have fallen under that umbrella. And I think that's such an important piece then, coming back to, let's be a trauma-informed school, and we're gonna embrace this for every kid, not just for particular kids. It's not a program, right? It's a way we design our school culture. That was such an important piece for me. And it's so critical too, because, you know, again, reinforcing the point that they said, we will not know who has and who hasn't. Some kids will present, some kids' parents will come in and tell us and talk to the counselors and do all that stuff, but the majority of that 1 in 5, we won't know, right? So we have to think about it in terms of that.
Sorry to cut you off,
No,
Janice, especially when they said last week that trauma is a one fits one.
Yes.
So you have no clue. We don't even know how things affect the people in our own households.
Amen.
You know, I often think back to how I grew up. I have 3 sisters and a brother, and we all have different recollections of childhood.
Yeah.
We all have different experiences, and I can look at us and see how certain things impacted each one of us differently.
Yep.
So if you can't even identify something within your own family, within your own unit, you certainly won't be able to identify it from a stranger, which is a child that might walk into your classroom.
Yep.
You won't know. And so that's why I love that idea that we're going to do it for everybody,
Yeah.
whether they have an IEP or whether they are, that they seem like the happiest kid in the room.
Yeah.
We're going to treat everybody this way, and that way everybody benefits, whether they quote unquote need it or not. I absolutely love that.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And again, we talk about that in terms of being a trauma-informed school. They're doing work in the community we came from, that we both grew up in,
Yes.
on trauma-informed communities. And what that says to me is, now it's the kids, it's the adults, it's everybody who lives here,
Exactly.
right? We're approaching every interaction with everybody who lives here with the idea that could be their experience, and so therefore we're gonna create trust, we're gonna create safety, we're gonna create all these things. So talk to me about some other pieces. What were some of the other pieces that were important to you?
So, okay, first and foremost, I have to say, and I hope that this doesn't come off as offensive to either one of them,
Mm-hmm.
but I often couldn't tell whether I was listening to Michelle or whether I was listening to Lisa.
Yeah.
To me, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Because that tells me that they are absolutely on the same page.
Yeah.
They have one voice, they have one message, they have a shared passion. And to me, that made the idea of buying in
Yes.
to what they have to say so much easier, because it wasn't this, scripted kind of thing. It wasn't them stumbling over some material that they'd read or something they'd studied. Like, it is very clear that those are the right women
Yeah.
in the right roles doing this work, and it is going to help people. It's already helped people.
Absolutely.
But I think even hearing this podcast is going to help so many people because of that.
Yeah.
So I just want to say kudos to both of them, and I want to thank them from the bottom of my heart for what they are doing.
Yes.
It's even more impactful that it is home.
Of course.
That they're working in a place where I have nieces and nephews
Mm-hmm.
and great nieces and cousins and family members and friends. It's impactful, but knowing that their message is going to spread across
Yes.
the world. Listening to this podcast, spreading it, all of that message is so important, and they are two of the most powerful people to deliver it.
Yeah.
That I had to say off top. But some of the things that really stood out for me, although it was about the school, was the fact that they were employing the same methods inside the school as they are outside.
Yes, right?
Like, at the end of the day, you could have told me that this podcast was about doing these things in my family,
Right.
or doing these things at my church, or doing these things at my community center. It doesn't have to be school. And they were very clear about the fact that this is not just about a classroom,
Right.
although it is giving teachers a tool in the classroom. So I thought that really stood out to me. I really had about 3 or 4 main things that popped out. One started in the first episode,
Okay.
but was certainly reinforced in this one. And as you and I know from the conversation we had after the podcast last time, this one, it hit me like a brick.
Okay.
Like, guilty, my issue helps me. It's this idea that parents and teachers have to give up this idea of proving our power
Right.
to children.
Yep.
Reinforcing to them that I'm the adult. What I say goes, it's my way or no way, because this is my home, my class, my group, whatever. The fact that we have to change that way of looking at things. So that escalation piece, that de-escalation
Yes.
piece from last time was powerful. This time, same thing about, they mentioned calling children out
Yes.
in front of their peers. Like,
I love the
that's
analogy
a
she gave to
power thing.
adults, right? Like, teachers
Yeah,
wouldn't like
exactly.
it if their principal leaned in and called them out. I love that.
That's exactly right. And it's a power thing. Like, at the end of the day, if we relinquish that need to prove that we are the person in power,
Right.
not saying that we don't have a power and that we shouldn't use it properly, but just that need to prove it,
Yeah.
ends up, when it's about ego. And so when you can let go of the ego, you could probably get a lot more done. And so that was a really powerful thing for me in my personal life, and thinking about schools. They told a story, I think you did, about the way a teacher interacted with another student
Yes.
in the class and how it impacted your daughter.
Yep.
So really, really quickly, I had a situation with my own son where him and his teacher had a disagreement over a social issue. I won't get into the
Sure.
specifics, but the teacher, who had always allowed my son to wear a certain sweatshirt, because they disagreed, was really nasty about making him take off the
Change
sweatshirt
the
in
rules.
class in front of everybody.
Yeah.
And it really bothered my son. It impacted him greatly. So just knowing that they are telling people and telling teachers that your actions have consequences in
Yes.
these students' lives, it just, that was everything for me. And I hope that parents and teachers alike are thinking about that when they do things like that, call kids out or let their personal feelings interfere with how they conduct their classrooms. The other big thing for me, Janice, was the word connection.
Yeah.
And that experiment where they had to put stickers
Yep.
to the kids they're connected with. Like, I think we don't think about how our kids are connecting with teachers and all of that in school. We just want them to get good grades. But again, they spend 8 hours a day with these people. And so a connection with them, at least one or two people. I can't imagine being in a place for that many hours a day where I don't feel connected to anyone that can really alter my life. I mean, yeah, my friends, I'll feel a connection to, but if there's no teacher, no administrator, no principal that I feel connected to, no wonder we have kids that are not doing well or are, it's so clear when it's pointed out that way.
Absolutely.
And so I love the ideas that were presented on how to do that. And I don't want to talk.
No, you're good.
I told you this really impacted me. So the other two things, the first one is the brain science.
Yes.
Like, I think every person with a child in their life, whether they're a parent or a teacher or a community leader, we have to do that. We have to do that research.
Yeah, we have to know that.
This is science.
Yeah.
Yes, we have to know that.
Yep.
This is science. This isn't an opinion. This isn't a behavioral thing. Like, this is the way they are wired.
Yeah.
And if we don't have a basic understanding of that, we'll do everything wrong.
That's it.
We're not thinking. Like, I often think about my own 15-year-old son who, if I just went off of the way I think and the way he behaves, like, he literally thinks he's a grown man at 15. He thinks he has it all figured out. He thinks he could go out there tomorrow and start his life. And I have to really remind myself about the brain science.
Yeah.
Like, his brain isn't even developed.
Exactly. And he doesn't know it. That's the
and
thing.
He doesn't know it. And if I don't know it
right.
as well, then I'll give in to this crazy idea that he can do it because he's mature and he's well-spoken. But he's not. He's a 15-year-old with an underdeveloped brain.
Exactly.
So we really need to spread that message and make that information available and get parents informed, parents, teachers, everybody, about that brain science. Like, that is major stuff.
Well, I'll add this part to that. I think that, what's fascinating about that is that in his 15-year-old brain, it is the decision-making part of your brain that is least developed right now at his age, right? And how powerful it is as a parent to be able to say, let's talk about your brain, right? Let's not talk about your behaviors, but let's talk about the science behind it. So now it's not about me versus you, but also when Michelle said that we have to remember there are certain emotions that have to be taught. They're not innate. And she listed humility, forgiveness, empathy, compassion, optimism, sympathy, patience, shame, cooperation, gratitude. Yes, I wrote them down because I thought, oh my gosh, I don't think the general public understands that these aren't things we're born with. And in fact, we get frustrated with children and with adults who don't display them. But if nobody has ever taught them, and then of course she goes into this idea that the fact is we have to embrace the idea that she said parenting is being outsourced. Now, for all of my parents, including us, that doesn't mean we're not doing a good job. It just means, to your point, Melissa, if they're 8 hours a day with somebody else, somebody else has to also be teaching. And to your point, too, it's this idea that we are always modeling something for kids. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we want to model, right? So in your son's experience with that teacher, if she were to go back and think about that, what was she modeling, and was that her intention? Right? Anyway, go ahead. I wanted to emphasize that.
Yeah, that's pretty major to me, and I do think that has completely, from last week, it has completely altered the way that I think about my interactions with him.
Yeah.
Things that normally would frustrate the crap out of me that he might be doing, or I think back on past things that have occurred, and I'm just like, yeah, makes complete sense if your brain is not developed all the way.
Yeah.
But what's my excuse as an adult?
That's a good point.
Mine is.
Exactly.
But while my brain is developed, I don't know what I don't know.
Yeah.
And so if I'm not operating with all the information, I'm too going to make those mistakes.
That's
so
it.
I just think this is really, really important work. And like I said, for anybody, because I'm not aware of any major trauma that myself or my son have endured, but these things work, even for us. And so that idea of teaching it to everybody and treating everybody the same way absolutely works. So I guess the last thing for me was, and it's the one that has the most stars on my notepad, was education is not the only focus.
Yeah.
Right now during this pandemic, because I know that there are so many parents feeling pressure right now to be teachers.
Yeah.
Who's never had a day of educational training, who may not even understand the assignments and the lessons themselves. Because I'm telling you, if you put Common Core math in front of me,
oh heck no,
it's like expecting me to teach French, and I've never even studied one part of it. So I think it's necessary to tell parents that yes, your child's education is important, but we also acknowledge that you have concerns, like Michelle said, about food and shelter. So, I know that we as parents are constantly, we do care about our kids' education, but it's okay for parents to hear right now that we know that you're also concerned about food and shelter and how you're going to pay your bills. And some of us have lost jobs, and some of us are being worked even harder than we were before, now that we're working from home. Like, there's all these different things that are playing a part as well that require and deserve our attention, sometimes even more than the education at this point.
Yeah.
And hearing them say that was, sometimes we just need to hear it. We need the validation that you're not harming your children.
Yes.
If you can't figure out their math homework right now, or if you can't find the time to make sure they're getting every single assignment done every single day, like, that's okay. And then the fact that we have to remember, I think this is a huge takeaway. Kids are going through this too.
Yeah.
And I don't think we stop to think about that sometimes, adults. They're missing their friends. They're missing their teachers. They've got a loss of their daily routine. They're scared. There are adults who are terrified. So, of course, kids feel that energy and don't understand why they can't go outside or visit friends. And I don't know that we as adults are as cognizant of that as we should be.
Yeah.
So I love the idea they said about, making time for a walk, if that's all you can do.
Yep.
Or a board game, if that's all you can do. But something to let them feel some semblance of normalcy and connection as a family, as a unit, despite all the stress, despite all the fear.
Yeah.
I think that's important and maybe at the top of the list over, the educational requirements. It's not saying don't teach them, but it just might not be something you're teaching from a book. You might be teaching them how to cook. You might be teaching them how to do laundry. You might be teaching them how to be resilient.
Yeah, absolutely. Teaching them the life
teaching
skills that you can teach
That's
them.
exactly
right.
That's exactly right.
So
those were my takeaways.
And I, of course, I had so many thoughts, as exactly what happens when the two of us chat like this. And you've touched on many of them. And one of them was the idea of, again, that idea, whether you're the parent or the teacher, and you got it with your son's example of self-regulation, right? I have to recognize in myself first, this idea, they talk about the expression of flipping your lid, right? As the adult, I have to realize I'm flipping my lid and going up that ladder in order to be able to bring myself back down and then help the kid be able to come back down. And I think that that's absolutely true happening in our houses right now, as you said, because of the isolation, right, as a result of COVID, but certainly bringing it back to teachers and classrooms. Eventually we're going to get back to classrooms, right? And my hope is, with the timing of this, that teachers aren't in a classroom with kids right now, but they can be thinking about these things and reflecting on these things and really being honest with themselves about their own practices, as can leaders, right? Because Michelle and Lisa gave us a lot of things to think about in terms of what leaders can do to begin the conversation. And I think that's going to be beneficial, because it certainly made me reflect on times with kids, both at the classroom and the leadership level, where I can think of, okay, was my response because I was going up the ladder, right? And so
Right.
how do I acknowledge that, right? With kids at school, with kids at home, etc. But you then kind of came around to the point that I definitely wanted us to wrap up with, which is this idea of, okay, so how do we think about social and emotional learning now, right? In this instance. And I've had so many conversations with educators, teachers, counselors, assistant superintendents, school level leaders, et cetera, over the last couple of weeks because of my job. And it's interesting to me how often I don't hear people talking about social emotional learning. And so that when I am getting a few people talking about it, I jump on it and I think, oh my gosh, thank you for that, right? So I'm gonna do a COVID-19 special edition episode. I've done one. I'm going to do a second one. We're going to tape it this week with a woman who used to be a school psychologist and now has her own private practice with kids. And she's going to pick up on Michelle and Lisa's thinking about strategies teachers can use in the classroom. And this child psychologist is going to talk about, okay, how can you do it, teachers, from a distance, right? What can you incorporate in the distance work that you're doing with kids? So we're going to get to that, but it's reinforced. I love when it's reinforced by real time, because this morning before you and I hopped on here, I was listening to the news and I happened to hear an interview with Arnie Duncan, and all I kept thinking was, oh, please, why isn't Arnie Duncan leading the Department of Night right now? But that's a different podcast. We won't get into that. But anyway, I was thrilled to hear him say exactly what you just said, that even more important than academics right now is the social emotional needs of our kids. That if for now we have to focus on getting those basic needs met. And yes, that's a Maslow's hierarchy, of shelter and food and those things. But then in kind of included with those is this, just their sense of feeling safe, their sense of feeling secure, that the adult that's with them they can trust, whether that's their parent or, as more schools are launching distance learning in the next couple of weeks, it's their teachers across a computer, right? So, and that's exactly, funny enough, the conversation I was having with Michelle and Lisa after our recording, right? After we recorded the interview, we kind of kept talking about the current circumstance. So I want to kind of close the episode here, right? Our educator audience, if they haven't already, I'm hoping that you take some time to take this learning and introduce it. Think about how you can introduce it into your distance learning experience with kids right now, right? Knowing that relationships are so critical. We heard that time and time again from Michelle and Lisa throughout this episode, the last episode, etc. For all kids, and especially those kids who've experienced trauma, what can we do right now in this moment, in the reality that we have, in order to ensure that we're building on those relationships, right? Now, this is an opportunity for us. So yes, academics is critical, and we're going to provide the opportunity for kids to learn, and we're going to provide the opportunities for parents to support that. Keeping in mind for parents, as you said, Melissa, just do what you can. There's no such thing as failing at this. There's no such thing as failing, right? You're just going to do what you can. But the truth is that we know that if their basic needs haven't been met, that they are way less available for learning, right? Which is why I want to encourage our teacher audience to think about some ways, and why I'm going to bring the child psychologist into a special episode next week that'll come out right after this one. So, but one thing I can share with you that is an idea that has come from all the conversations I've had with educators is, some schools where they're having teachers call. They're asking teachers to make their main focus every day to call 5 kids, right? And just check in on them, right? How are you doing? What's something fun you've done? Are you okay, right? Kind of getting to, are you okay? Can they identify some needs of kids beyond food, et cetera, that the school can be helping with right now that they just don't know because we haven't asked? So that in and of itself, I'll leave this episode with as one strategy between now and the time that special edition airs that teachers and leaders can be thinking about. Just strategically calling every kid's home and talking to the kid. I don't care if the kid is a 5-year-old in kindergarten or an 18-year-old senior, right? Talking to each kid to say, I'm thinking about you. And we see so much of that on social media right now, teachers posting, etc. I'm just encouraging folks to take an additional step if they haven't already. And I know some have, because I've seen some of that, of really reaching out to each kid. And a phone call is way different than an email. So just keeping that in mind. Here's the thing, right? To all of my educator listeners out there, we know how hard you guys work, period. And we certainly know that you are working harder now than ever before. That of everyone sitting at home right now, you are certainly not feet kicked up, eating bonbons, watching daytime television, because not only are you trying to do what's best for our kids, you're trying to also support your own. So for that, we thank you.
And I'll say, if they didn't know how hard you work, parents are learning it firsthand right now. And that is
So
also
true.
by all of the, people joke about it, but it's very serious that these parents don't know how to teach. That's not something they've been educated to do or know how to do. So if they haven't appreciated you before, that's one thing I think will change as a result of this. But I agree with you 100%, and I want to add my thank you to yours. I'm so grateful for everything. I've always been for everything teachers do, but even more so now, because they're expected to pick up and do something that none of us know how to do. We don't know how to do this. This is brand new to all of us, but they are expected to do it not only for themselves and their families, but their students. And that's major. So thank them for that.
And honestly, if you've been one of those people out there listening to this podcast right now, if you've ever been somebody who thought teaching was a backup career, a backup profession, it's something you do when you can't do something else, hopefully what we're learning right now is that is further from the truth than just about anything, right? That it does take a special education, it does take a special heart, it does take a special set of skills, and that the people who are doing it because, in almost all cases, because they had a calling. And what we're hoping to do is support the growth of their skill set so they can do it even better. And that's a profession who, in the moment, turned on a dime and said, wait, we have to do it 100% different?
Exactly.
Okay, here we go, right? So thank you to Michelle and Lisa as well. You guys, thank you for kicking off this 4-part series, and the work that you're doing. I'll echo Melissa's thanks from earlier. It's just so critical, and I have no doubt that I said to them already they'll be back. So let's sneak peek episode 11, where we're going to continue to build on this conversation around trauma, but we're going to shift from the professionals to the parent. We're going to be joined next week by Charlotte Patton, who has supported her daughter Sabrina, who has experienced a series of trauma-inducing experiences over her childhood. Charlotte has agreed to share the challenges of supporting a child who has experienced trauma and what she has certainly learned along the way. There is no doubt that her perspective will be powerful in this larger discussion around trauma, and she'll have plenty to share that's valuable to both parents and educators. So tune in next week for episode 11, and we'll get to it.